It's so good to be together today in this sacred space and time where we welcome all who hunger for a spiritual home of acceptance and love. Our generations join together to nurture that spiritual growth that we may be inspired to go forth into the world, transforming it with love, hope, compassion, and justice. I'm Kristen Ingalls, one of your worship associates who help facilitate our services when Reverend Tamara is not in the pulpit. And today I have the great pleasure of sharing the pulpit with, I hope, a dear friend, one of our longtime members, Peter Haslund. I've known Peter for over 30 years, and I always grapple with how to introduce him at one of these services because I have been his worship associate before. We do the Kristen and Peter show. He is a many-faceted person. His accomplishments, talents, dedication, and action, that could be a service into itself. So when we discussed the sermon topic, he said to me, "What would you like me to speak on?" An election year is a perfect thing for a political science professor to speak on. But then I thought about it and I said, you know, I wanted something much more, not the public Peter, but the private Peter. And in the years I've known him, I have come to admire and respect who he is as a person. A tireless worker and supporter of all things Unitarian Universalist, a social and political activist, but mostly a warm, kind, dedicated man. A man who seems to me to have a deep sense of joy and contentment with his life. A happy man. And I'm told by his wife that he is constantly active, always finding new and intriguing ways of learning, building, creating, and helping. So at a time most of us his age are slowing down, he's going full speed ahead. So welcome, Peter. Don't look at me like that.
So I get this email from Kristen. How'd you like to do the sermon on September 4th? She does it 2 months ahead of time, so you don't have a logical reason to say no. Besides, if you ever had any experience at all with Kristen, saying no is pointless. It's a complete waste of time. I suggested first a topic that is easy for me. I can talk about politics all day long, and I enjoy it. She said, no, something about you as a person. Instantly, I thought of 7 different ways of saying no. Because talking about yourself, I mean, how does it feel? But then I thought about it. I thought about it a little bit longer, and I thought, well, maybe this is an interesting way to explore origins of, I mean, I've always been curious about who I am and how I come across and what I value and why I do the silly things that I do. So I said, okay, I'll do it. It won't be just a focus on me because relatively speaking, I am not important. What may be important here is the process by which we learn about who we are. And I'm of the view that learning who we are is really an important ingredient. My curiosity about this subject was piqued by an editorial, an op-ed piece by David Brooks in the New York Times last April, which he talked about a moral bucket list. And he wondered out loud and perhaps rhetorically whether we wanted to be remembered by the content of our resume or by the virtues contained in our eulogy. I let that one spin around my head for a while because I can write one hell of a resume. And the resume is what I say about me. A eulogy is what somebody else says about me. I thought, probably I would not want to be remembered by my resume. And that the eulogy would contain things of value. I mean, I've attended a number of memorial services, and as we get older, we attend more and more of them. And what comes across in the eulogy is that the person was kind, was thoughtful, was patient perhaps, trustworthy, willing to go the extra mile to help a neighbor. This led me to inquire internally, how do we acquire, how do we learn about this stuff? Who teaches us? When were these lessons disseminated? Was I present? Was I taking notes? Now this should be uniquely interesting to Unitarian Universalists because in other faiths, this question has an immediate answer. There's God through the Bible, the Torah, the Quran. The answers are all there in perfect prose. Unitarian Universalists are a little uncomfortable with that, although we cite as one of our sources those people who we have come to respect, their authorities. They speak to us, and their quotations are contained in numerous sermons. But I'm here to suggest that we might be better off, or additionally better off, learning from our own experience and from the behavior of those special people in our lives. Last week, Jim Ross reminded us of the words of Maya Angelou. We are more the same than we are different. Yet, early lessons seem to point in the opposite direction. Early on, we seek to differentiate ourselves from everybody else, perhaps in search of identity, perhaps in search for a sense of community. I remember the Peanuts image where he has just finished constructing his playhouse or his treehouse, and on the front says a sign that says, "No girls allowed." A first introduction to the contest between them and us. When I first visited China in 1984, I looked to them for difference. What I discovered was that on the basics, we were not very different at all. They loved their families just as we did. They loved good food. They loved to laugh. They loved music. They loved good stories. They were fond of each other. They valued friendship, and point of fact, probably more so than we do. So we are similar. Maya Angelou was right. There are differences between us, though. There are differences between us and us. There are differences between you and me. And I've wanted to explore just how that happens and why we might be so different. And maybe this is what Socrates had in mind when he said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And this was a sinful inquiry that landed him in hot water with the authorities. And he was ultimately convicted and executed for this terrible sin. So I begin with the premise that it's a good idea that we have a look at ourselves, our values, and try to see from whence they come. And maybe this is what Parker Palmer had in mind. with today's centering thought. He said, before you tell your life what truths and values you have decided to live up to, let your life tell you what truths you embody, what values you represent. Hence my focus on the origins of our values and our way of being in life. Now, unlike commodities, values are not available for sale. You can't go to Vons and buy 6 for $9.99. And since we're not born with values, at least I don't think we are, I conclude that values sort of tend to grab us as we are speeding along through life in search of what some would call success. You may be entirely oblivious to the acquisition of values until someone asks, where did that come from? And that's what got me to thinking about connections between life experience and values, especially my values. I was born in Copenhagen in 1939 to unmarried parents on the eve of World War II and the Nazi occupation of Denmark. Not only were my parents unmarried, but my birth appears to have been so upsetting to my father that he ended the relationship. Essentially, my mother had said no to a second abortion, and that was that. Now, I never met him, but I wondered a lot about him. And that we didn't meet was clearly his choice, not mine. I know him through stories told about him. I know him through his autobiography. But I wonder, what lessons might I have learned? Or, on the contrary, was I better off not to have been influenced by somebody who had an express preference for not being a parent? I'll never know for sure. A second source of impact on my life was the German invasion. Though occupation forces were fairly restrained during the first few years, by 1943, Hitler had changed his mind about letting the Danish government deal with its internal affairs, especially Danish Jews, of which there were 8,000. And surely they would be better off if rounded up and transported to Theresienstadt, which was a concentration camp in northern Czechoslovakia. My mother was a candidate. She was one of those Jews. The story of the rapid evacuation of 8,000 Jews from Denmark to Sweden is legendary, and my mother participated in that exodus. Now, for a bunch of reasons, I was left in Denmark. I like to think it was because of some early recognition of my political skills that would be useful in handling the affairs of the country while everybody else was gone. At any rate, I was sent to a farm near the small city of Slagelse. There's a test afterwards. You have to learn to pronounce that word. Where I became a farmer under an assumed name and a make-believe identification papers. I became a farmer in every sense of the word. Each morning, I would help feed the chickens, pretend to milk the cows. Well, they were big cows. And then take off to the fields, sometimes for much of the day, with my trusty dog in tow who would share my lunch. If German soldiers would visit the farm, there was a place in the hayloft where I would stay until they went away. I could look down from the hayloft and see Germans, troops. They were probably looking for a chicken or some fresh eggs rather than me. The daily routine would include a nap in the living room and on the living room couch with Mr. Mickelson, who was my foster father, and end up with going to bed at the foot of their bed. I had my own bed, and having a nightly conversation about tomorrow. I would always begin the conversation. I would ask, Mickelson, see, we grown-ups always refer to each other by our last name. You know. Mickelson, what are we going to do tomorrow? He would always respond with plans, usually beginning with feeding the chickens. And perhaps we would have to help our neighbor who might have a problem with a piece of farm machinery or something else. Perhaps we would have to be repairing something that was broken. There was always something. But the important thing was that there was always a tomorrow. His words were soothing to me. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. I needed to know that there would be a tomorrow, and this allowed me to drift off to sleep. My life was complete on the farm. It was different from my life in Copenhagen, which quickly faded into a foggy past. Here in Slagelse, I was safe. Life was good. I had my horses, my chickens, and my cows, people who cared about me, people who I could admire. I had an identity. I was a farmer. I was ultimately reunited with my mother in 1947, and understandably, she had difficulty recognizing me. One changes a lot between the ages of 4 and 7. Had it not been for a freckle and a small scar on my left thumb, she might not have recognized me, and somebody else would have been giving this sermon. The transfer back to the city life was hard for me. I remember that. I remember missing the farm and its very predictable way of life. My horses, my cows, my chickens, the Mikkelsons, all were gone now, replaced by trolley cars, bicycles, schools, and an upstairs apartment. There was, of course, Tivoli. I like Tivoli. Now that was my first 7 years of life, which served as an introduction to civil society. The question then is, what values came from those early experiences? This is not to say that I haven't acquired values subsequent to that, but I suspect that they're mostly amplifications of the values that I had already acquired. Though I don't remember much from the German occupation, I do remember those marching troops. They were very splendid, but they were not friendly. They were not terribly menacing either. But there was always the understanding that they could be the source of imminent and potential danger. Something could happen at any time. One just knew it was there, that subtle sense of discomfort, dis-ease. This sense was probably exacerbated by my periodic visits to the hayloft on the farm, with instructions to be very, very quiet. I'm still pretty quiet. At least you get me until you get me going on some topic like Donald Trump. But I'm not likely to be the first to speak. There is for me a sense of greater safety in being next. I might learn something that would be helpful. My most anguishing experience was in October 1943, when I discovered that my mother had left and probably would not be coming back. I remember feeling intense sadness of being abandoned, of being completely alone. I was 4 years old, but I remember that trauma. Thereafter, I learned to be alone and ultimately to be comfortable, striking out on my own, taking my lunch and my dog for a long walk around the farm, and being at peace with that in some way. If there was a value derived from this experience, it had to do with the development of a sense of self-reliance. But there was always an emotional scar. I don't think I was ever fully reconciled with my mother. We never had a conversation about what happened. On my part, a likely safeguard against her going away again. She died when I was 23, and I simply had not developed the emotional maturity to explore the sources of that estrangement. I wish I had. I loved my life as a farmer. There was a daily routine. There were expectations. Everyone did their part. Even my small part was treated as if it were the equal to everyone else's. Life was quiet on the farm. No ups, no downs, no drama, just a steady, one day at a time routine. I learned the value taking one's time and looking both ways before making a decision. When words were used, and they were not often used, they had meaning. People listened. I learned to listen. By contrast, my mother could flare up at a moment's notice. Nope, definitely not a farmer. Finally, the war was over. It was May 1945. I'm certain that the experience of war had an impact on me. I remember watching the once proud German army march home. I remember them casting aside heavy equipment and helmets and uniforms. There was joy in watching them go home to Germany. But a part of me also felt their despair. They had lost. They had lost everything. They were sad. And as I later learned, had nothing to go home to. I learned something about empathy that in some small way mitigated against a long military occupation. There had been no school for me in Slagelse, probably related to the fear that my not-so-well-crafted identity papers would not stand the test of scrutiny should I attempt to enroll. But when the war was over and I returned to Copenhagen, I retrieved my identity and was enrolled in Gunnar Jørgensen School. I think I missed the first grade. I'm not sure what academic price I ultimately paid. But my education about farm animals and harvests were second to none. Midway through the third grade, my mother announced that we would be leaving Denmark for the United States. Despite my understanding that this was the home of Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and Tarzan, I expressed a clear preference for staying in Denmark. Why on earth would I want to go to America? I had heard that there were millions of people in America, perhaps thousands, far more than there were in all of Denmark, and that they did not speak Danish. No, I'd rather stay in Denmark. But then I had another experience. Our headmaster had invited an American serviceman to address the assembly of all the enrolled students in school. Though his words were translated, they were in English, I didn't hear a word of the translation. I was instead fixated on his color. He had very dark skin and a very deep voice. I'm not sure whether I was more attracted to the deep voice or the color of his skin, but I think the skin color won out. This was the most beautiful, deep brown skin I had ever seen. I remember asking my friend Leif how on earth one could get skin color like that. And after much thought, he told me that he had heard that one might acquire such color in America. Well, that night, I told my mother that I had reconsidered and that going to America might be okay. And in March of 1949, we sailed on the SS Stockholm for New York Harbor, and I became an American. America was big. I recall walking around New York streets looking straight up. These buildings were huge. And then we boarded a bus for that certain forever ride to California. On the way, the bus stopped to pick up a passenger. He was dark-skinned, like the guy I had seen in school. The bus driver greeted him with derision and ordered him to the back of the bus. He used a word I had never heard before. It was the N-word. I had to ask my mother what that meant. This was my introduction to racism and, in a sense, to America. It took me a long time to understand how perfectly ordinary people could be so mean to each other. I can still see the hurt in the face of that African American who climbed aboard the Greyhound bus in late spring 1949. I can see his face today. Well, it's time to draw some conclusions, and as my friend, the Reverend Tony Perino, used to say, you have to get to the so what part of the sermon. I have no illusions that I am either complete or objective in assessing what I have learned from that first decade of life. You may see different things. You can tell me about them. Be nice. I know that I have a special interest in fairness. I can get easily incensed if I think something is unfair, either to me or to others. I was taken aback when, as a young adult, I was told that, get used to it. Life is not fair. But why isn't it fair? There's an idealist hiding inside of this concept, and I think he would have voted for Bernie. But for the life of me, I have never understood why the color of one's skin should be a variable in how one is treated. It makes no sense. It is not fair. The German occupation was not fair. But I also learned something about empathy for the downtrodden, regardless of the circumstances. They were soldiers, following orders, certainly not free from all responsibility, but not to blame for the occupation either. I also think that my early imprinting included a healthy dose of being independent, of making my own decisions. Some, even in this room who are close to me, would suggest that this is subtext for being stubborn. I think there may be some truth in that. We live in a world of contradictions, though I would wish it to reflect the simple life that I remember on the farm. In reality, it is complex, reflecting the values of contemporary technology, of globalization, and our very, very busy lives. Too often, my world seeks to resolve differences quickly, a process often short of patience and punctuated by loud and angry voices, sometimes giving way to domestic discord or international violence of the sort that underscored my first 5 years of life. Though war may appear to be a tempting shortcut to resolving problems, it should instead be seen as a failure by leaders who decline to take account of the human cost to those who would never be consulted. I find myself to be an optimist, and I assume that people around me are good and honest, and it saddens me when I discover otherwise. I enjoy working with others toward a common goal. Working together is often costly in terms of time, and ours is a world in which everything must be done at lightning speed and with great efficiency. But at a cost, sometimes to ourselves, sometimes to those who might be left behind. They were not heard. We did not listen. We may not have time to help a neighbor. It doesn't fit into our schedule. But I've discovered that when you do, the neighbor smiles in recognition of a unique kindness. The neighbor may also express great surprise, but the smile comes later. Friends visiting from China will tell me that I work too hard. I plead guilty. The work habits of immigrants are often characterized as such. And much of this is derived from a feeling of having to compete with those who were born here, a fear of never quite measuring up. But there's a price to be paid for this hectic pace of life in terms of missed opportunities to simply inhale, to smell the roses. Early imprinting from my time on the farm serves as a gentle reminder of what's possible. It's a struggle for me, but I do slow down from time to time. There were many helpful lessons learned on that farm in occupied Denmark a long, long time ago. They sneak up on me when I least expect it. They remind me that it's good to inhale. It may be helpful to see my life on the farm as a metaphor for a special time and place where values are formed. I suspect that each of you has a farm somewhere, a place where fundamental learning took place. And I would invite you to revisit that special place in your life. What was it like on your farm? What lessons did you experience? And were you taking notes?
So please remain standing and join hands so that all are included in our circle. Our benediction are the words of Pablo Picasso. The meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away. So may we all find and give and have a long, long journey.